Welcome and good morning. We're talking about transitions. We're talking about some of the words that go along with transition, and that may be a little more important for some than others. We know this week we have some transitions. We have Matthew's birthday. Happy birthday to Matthew. We have Paul and Melissa's anniversary tomorrow. We have moving day. Mrs. Jean, there's a transition. We have Trisha's birthday was Wednesday, but we already sang happy birthday twice. One to add a year, one to take away, so it all worked out. But life is about transitions, isn't it? It doesn't stay the same. One day after another, things adjust, things change. Sometimes we like that, and sometimes we don't. We're ending our short sermon series, short because we usually do more weeks than this, but this is number 4. It gets us from right when they leave the Red Sea up into they're about to make a big transition here in chapter 19. On the 3rd month after the Israelites left Egypt, they came to the desert of Sinai, and where they stick around for a bit, and we have the 10 Commandments. Some questions to get you started. Do the transitions, maybe transitions isn't the word that you connect with. How about changes, adaptations? How about the word stresses in life tend to bring out the best or the worst in you? Does transition help, hinder? How do you usually respond to the transitions, changes, adaptations, the stresses in life where things looked like they were going one way and now they have to change? You've got to adapt and work through it. Do you tend to be confident or unconfident in your decisions in these times? I thought it was going this way and now I have to make other changes. In the stresses of life, do you tend to be more confident or less confident? To wishy-washy, back and forth. Well, I could do this, I could do that, I don't know what to do, where am I at, whose input? That's where we're going today, is talking about wisdom in transition. Who do you go to for help and direction, and where do they go to provide their input? Google's got a lot to say about all kinds of things. But where does that information come from? And you can ask 10 different people and they can give you 12 different answers. But where do they go for information? When you're not sure about what to do, who do you talk to? What's the source of their information? And maybe nobody can give you a definitive and absolute answer. But are they coming with spiritual wisdom? And how does that help you? Transitioning in life can be difficult. We want to do so in the best ways possible, which means trusting God in the process, trusting that His view, His understanding, His perception is what we're missing, because we need to seek wisdom. Amen. We want to be wise people. We want to seek God's wisdom, not just our own wisdom. A part of trusting God is to seek Him in His wisdom, which had me thinking about a passage, James 3:17. And you're thinking, wow, that's been a while since hasn't been that long. Some of you even have it as a bookmark, just like that. Do you remember the passage? James 3:17, because it's a good one to remember this week. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. We had a sermon series that went through each of those qualifiers. How God's wisdom is different than the way of the world. And it is first of all pure. God's wisdom is undefiled. It is accurate. It is true. It is trustworthy. And nothing else compares to it. So where have we been? We've been in the wonderful land of the Exodus. The beauty of the desert. And we thought, I don't like it in the desert. Some people do. But they went from the fertile land of Egypt, right around the river, beautiful. And then they're going to the promised land of Canaan, rivers. But in between, they spend a long time walking through the sand. We began at the grumbling of the water, where I wanted us to make the connection that that's when we grumble about the big things about life. Is God even there? Does he care? Now what? And then about the manna. Well, we complain sometimes about the daily needs. Is God actually caring for me right now? And then that can be a problem because we rely so much on God for the daily needs that we forget what work we're supposed to do alongside of it. Last week was how the battle looks different when you're in the middle of it. Because God is a God of protection, but he's also a God of provision. And these are the concepts that help us trust God in transition. This week we're going to conclude the series by looking at Moses gaining wisdom, because our God is not only a God of protection and provision, but he's a God of direction. How can we trust God? Well, he will give direction. Once Moses receives the wisdom, it impacts his life, but it also impacts the whole nation and how everything happens for everybody else. In a way, we're talking about advice, the giving and sharing of advice. We point out we start with a little sermon illustration story. A young minister, desirous of improving his preaching ability, wrote a letter to an elderly minister asking, "How may I improve my style?" The old gentleman, knowing something of the young man's pulpit eccentricities, wrote back, "Now, he's supposed to be a nice guy, right? You would think. Dear brother, when you go to preach, take care, you do not say, yours, Jacob Gruber." Point taken? Sometimes you ask advice and they're going to give it to you. The letter could have been, "Oh, you're fine, just do what you do." But no, he saw that as an opportunity. Came from somebody like my brother who thought it was funny. Advice is seldom welcome, and those who need it the most like it the least. And speaking of my brother, welcome to corrections. The ones that need it the most tend to like it the least. That's the way we're made. But everybody can be a source of information, advice. No man is so foolish, but he may sometimes give another good counsel. You can learn something from everybody, right? Good example, bad example, as Alvin used to say. And no man so wise that he may easily err if he takes no other counsel than his own. He that is taught only by himself has a fool for a master. You can learn something from everybody. Don't just rely on yourself. And another one about not taking advice. He that won't be counseled can't be helped. Part of wisdom in Scripture is asking for input, is being open to advice and putting those things together. But how do you give advice? How do you take advice? Samuel Coleridge, advice is like snow. The softer it falls, the longer it dwells, and the deeper it sinks in the mind. To give advice at a way that's being requested, in a way that's helpful, in a speed that's well received, all of that makes a difference. It can be good advice given poorly. It can be the right thing to say at the wrong time or the wrong motive. And so knowing how to do that. He that gives good advice builds with one hand. He that gives good counsel and example builds with both. But he that gives good admonition and bad example builds with one hand and pulls down with the other. You can give advice, but what are you doing? What's your example? How are you living it? It's a good reminder. It's not just what people say, it's how they live. Who do you receive advice from? So we're into today's section in Exodus. It seems a little odd to me that Moses needs direction. Why? Because he's Moses. Who's been directing Moses up to this point? Go ahead, it's a short Sunday school answer. God did. Who chose him? Who empowered him? Who called him? Who gave him everything to do the task? God did. Who was his counselor? Who did he directly get to talk to? God. And who had appointed him as a leader of the group? God did. But he gets to a point where he has to transition because there's a couple things in here. Why would he need guidance? Why wouldn't he just know what to do? Well, maybe it's because he was not asking God for direction. How about that? God had called him, empowered him, led him to this point, but now he's kind of on his own, doing his own thing, and stop asking how to handle this situation. He just thinks this is the way it's going to be done, and he gets into it. God often will not lead if you don't ask to be led. What do you think of the impact of that sentence? Does God force his leadership? Too bad sometimes. Just make me do the right thing. But he will not lead if we don't ask to be led. That's too often the case. So we have a responsibility to ask. And that reminds me of James 4:2. One section of that passage says, you do not have because you do not ask God. Why don't you have what you're looking for? Why do you get caught up in your old life? You don't have the new life that you want because you don't ask God. And he's not going to force it on you. Matthew 7:7, Jesus says, ask and it will be given you. Seek and you'll find. Knock and the door will be open. What if you don't do part one? What if you don't go to God? Why does he put our part first? Because it's a part of the relationship. Here's what I offer. Do you want it? And so it's a matter of the heart. Do I want to be led by God? Am I asking, seeking, knocking? And so in order for God to lead, we also ask him to lead. What wisdom and direction? Not just do you need. Do you see the importance of today's question? What wisdom and direction are you asking God for? Because that's the big takeaway this week, is God has the wisdom, but he won't force it on us. Are we asking for direction? So we have a lot of text to take a look at. Some of it we'll focus on more deeply than another. We're in Exodus chapter 18, page 115, if you're looking at the blue guest Bibles that are there. So we start with getting introduced to the main people in the process. Now Jethro, the priest of Midian and father-in-law of Moses, heard everything God had done for Moses and for his people Israel, and how the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. After Moses had sent away his wife Zipporah, his father-in-law Jethro received her and her 2 sons. So we have Jethro. Jethro's a priest, and he's the father-in-law of Moses. So he's the important character as we get going. The 2 sons, one son named Gershom, for Moses said, I have become an alien in a foreign land. Gershom's related to the word for alien. And the other was Eliezer, for he said, my father's God was my helper. And God, my helper, is the source of that word or that name. He saved me from the sword of Pharaoh. So name the children in ways that point to God. Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, together with Moses' son and wife, came to him in the desert, where he was camped near the mountain of God. Jethro had sent word to him, I, your father-in-law Jethro, am coming to you with your wife and her 2 sons. So they'd been apart. Jethro's coming. It's, hey, do you have time for a visit? Going to drop in for a coffee. Probably not. Camel milk? I don't know what they're going to have. Maybe tea. So Moses went out to meet his father-in-law and bowed down and kissed him. They greeted each other and then went into the tent. Moses told his father-in-law about everything the Lord had done to Pharaoh and the Egyptians for Israel's sake, and about the hardships they had met along the way, and how the Lord had saved them. So does Moses not know God? Or does he not attribute everything to God? He certainly does. He knows that God has done all of this so far, and where they've come and how God has been active. But keep that in mind as we look further into the text. Jethro was delighted to hear about all the good things the Lord had done for Israel in rescuing them from the hand of the Egyptians. He said, praise be to the Lord who rescued you from the hand of the Egyptians and of Pharaoh, and who rescued the people from the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all other gods, for he did this to those who treated Israel arrogantly. Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought a burnt offering and other sacrifices to God. And Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law in the presence of God. So there's a respect being developed here by Jethro. Jethro is now learning about God differently because of the encounters. Aaron and the elders are coming because Jethro is also a priest in Midian. And so there you have a group of leaders that are gathering together. In verse 13 it says, "The next day Moses took his seat to serve as judge for the people. And they stood around him from morning till evening. When his father-in-law saw all that Moses was doing for the people, he said, 'What is this you're doing for the people? Why do you alone sit as judge while all these people stand around you from morning till evening?'" Jethro sees a problem. Does this make sense to him? Who had he just had tea with? Who had just come together? Moses, Aaron, Jethro, the elders. Moses gets up the next day, goes to work, and what does he do? He takes Moses' seat of judgment, which is still called Moses' seat of judgment, and he alone hears every disagreement. And people just stand in line, waiting for Moses to hear and give an answer. Jethro says, "This doesn't make sense." Moses answered him, "Because the people come to me and seek God's will." "Why are you doing this?" "Well, they want to know God's will and they come to me for it. So that's what I do. Whenever they have a dispute, it's brought to me and I decide between the parties and inform them of God's decree and laws." Not Moses' view of the decrees and laws, but God's view of the decrees and laws. He listens to every case and says, "Okay, God, what's going on and how to answer?" And so this is what he does and spends his day doing it. The assumption by Moses is he's the only one able to lead, at least to lead in this way. He thinks that he alone has the connection to God that is necessary. But again, did he ask for help or wisdom in the passage? No. Who could he have asked to help out? Who? Could have asked Aaron, his brother. Could have asked the elders. Could have asked other people to be involved. But this is a pattern that he got started in, and now this is the way that it goes. But it's hindering everybody. Moses' father-in-law replied, "What you are doing is not good. You and these people who come to you will only wear yourselves out. The work is too heavy for you. You cannot handle it alone. Listen now to me, and I will give you some advice. And may God be with you. Listen, and I'll give you some advice." Then he reminds them what his primary responsibility is. You must be the people's representative before God and bring their disputes to him. That part he's not taking away. Here's the key part of your job. You are God's spokesman to them. So this is what you need to continue to do. But is the process worthy of some adaptation? In verse 20, he says, "Teach them. Teach them the decrees and laws, and show them the way to live and the duties they are to perform." Which reminds me of Ephesians 4:11 through 13. God gave some to be teachers, apostles, prophets, evangelists, to build up the church so that everyone's equipped to do the work. But he hadn't been doing that. He'd just been judging each case and sending them on their way. He hadn't been instructing them and raising up other people to do it. Verse 21, "But select capable men from all the people, men who fear God, trustworthy men who hate dishonest gain." You have some credentials here, and appoint them as officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. Have them serve as judges for the people at all times, but have them bring every difficult case to you. So there's a special role that Moses has. There's a special time when he can intervene, but have the simple ones, the easy ones, taken care of by the majority of people. If it's difficult, have the case come to you. The simple cases they can decide themselves. That will make your load lighter because they will share it with you. But guess what? Moses needs to ask God, accept wisdom, and step down from some things in order for other people to step up. What's the intended result? Why do all of this? Well, if you do this, and God so commands, you'll be able to stand the strain. And all the people will go home satisfied. It's better for you, and it's better for them when it's not all on one person. Moses listened to his father-in-law and did everything he said. He chose capable men from all Israel and made them leaders of the people, officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. They served as judges for the people at all times. The difficult cases they brought to Moses, but the simple ones they decided themselves. Then Moses sent his father-in-law on his way, and Jethro returned to his own country. That's the account. But did he need wisdom? Yes. Was he asking God for it? It doesn't seem like it, but wisdom still shows up. God sends somebody to provide wisdom. So there's some things about advice sharing and wisdom. He learned that his perspective was not the only perspective. Do you see that in there? He learned his way of doing it wasn't the only way. The account shows how to give and how to receive advice, the importance of it. Jethro knew who he was talking to, and Moses knew that Jethro had spiritual wisdom and experience in leadership. So one, the character of Jethro let him be the right person to be able to give advice to Moses. And Jethro spoke kindly and directly to Moses, and Moses listened and wasn't threatened by the advice. Again, they were both ready to give and receive there. It wasn't a power struggle or an argument. They were both seeking to do things better, a way that pleased God. Still, the change needed to be made. He was unable to meet the need, but why? Because he was in the center of the problem. He was so busy doing that he didn't have perspective to see it a different way. He couldn't get the perspective enough to find a solution, because every day he would get up and he would go and he would spend all day doing things. But were they the better things? There's some reminders for us today. The way that I read it or see it in there, there's at least the possibility he didn't ask God, so God didn't give him the counsel that he needed. From this, Moses learns to trust in the spiritual ability of others, and that he doesn't have to take on everything. He begins to see himself as part of a team of leaders, and that was going to be better for everyone. But it took a transition for him to get there. So we're going to ask ourselves to apply it for us. What part of the team do you play in our congregation? By the way, we don't need critics. Helpers, participants. What part of the team do we play? We need people to pray. We need discussion. We need advice. We need participants. But we need to work as a congregation. We need to work together. Where do you have room to step up and step in to offer your wisdom and participation? That's part of why we have our meetings. We need to have discussions about important topics and make good decisions together. Who gives you counsel when you're in transition? What spiritual advice do you receive? How do you receive spiritual advice? Do you look for spiritual advice? Well, now we get the rubber meets the road in a different way. How do you take advice or constructive criticism? What if somebody's advice is about what you're doing? How do you take that, and how do you give it? How do you offer your perspective to somebody else? All big questions from the passage. As they learn this lesson, it changes the nation and how they deal with the day-to-day struggles. How are you dealing with the transitions, changes, adaptations, stresses in your life? What do you tend to complain about? What we found is what they grumbled about. What concerns are on your mind? The things that wake you up, the things that don't go away quickly. Whose perspective are you seeking and trusting, and how does that make a difference to you? Who do you talk to about it that's offering a spiritual perspective? So today we conclude by asking, who do you go to for advice? Also realizing who comes to you for advice, and what's the source of the advice that we give, And does it bring God glory? The truth is, Exodus was an exodus that they went through, but we're always on a journey, aren't we? We are not where we will be, and we are not where we started. We are in the wilderness. Now is the time of transition. God is actively leading you through transitions. He knows where you need to be going, and He knows how to get you there, but we have to seek direction because the course can get too confusing to navigate on our own. Instinct is not enough. God has the perspective that's needed. We need His advice. And He will offer it, but He will not force it. If you continue reading, we're just going to finish our Exodus part there. But if you continue reading, God's not done leading them if they'll have Him as their leader. The next part is about Him leading them and then providing the 10 Commandments. As you go through transitioning, do not seek the wisdom of the world, seek God's counsel, and the promised land will not be far off. They need to be led and to remember. Miss Jean, that's a picture just for you. Trusting God in transition, like a bunch of moving boxes. What thoughts and questions has the series brought to mind? How has the series helped you, and where do you go from here? Because transition's not done. You're going to continue a life of transition. That's the only type of life we have. But we're also here to help others around us to trust God as they transition. Maybe this series has been helpful to be able to talk about, here's where I'm at, where are you at? Maybe it's so you're attentive to where people are at and what they're going through, and you can help through it, or you can see where God has led in the past. I don't know how God intends to use it with you, the work of the Spirit, but it's a topic that's always going to be relevant. Our next series is going to be from a Warren Wiersbe Bible study called Be Responsible. It's from 1 Kings. What are some of the lessons we learn? Again, another short series in the letter to the writing to 1 Kings. So next week, chapters 1 and 2, there's a fair bit there about the end of David's life and the beginning of a new leadership. So you see how it kind of connects to where we've been. Thanks for your time and attention.